Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something really fundamental, food safety.
Mm.
But not just, washing your veggies. We're talking about the whole system, how it's controlled, who has the power, and frankly, the politics picked right into it.
Yeah, it's surprisingly complex.
We've got some fantastic source material for this deep dive shared by you, our listener. It really lays out the history, the science, the political fights over keeping food safe.
It does. It covers a lot of ground from the early 1900s right up to modern issues like GMOs and even bioterrorism.
It's packed with details, some real eye-openers in there.
Absolutely. So our mission today, I think, is to pull out the core insights from all this material.
Mm.
We want to help you get a handle on, the main arguments in food safety disputes
Right.
and understand the roles of the different players. You've got industry, government, consumers, and see why this topic, which sounds purely scientific, is actually intensely political.
Yeah, it seems like it should be straightforward, but it's not.
Not at all. We'll distill the key connections for you.
And, digging into these sources, some surprising things pop out, like why regulations seem to lag behind the science sometimes,
Right.
or how political agendas might, influence safety decisions, and this idea of public trust, how crucial that actually is.
Exactly. It's a central theme.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we start? The roots seem to go way back.
They do. The sources really anchored the U.S. system in, believe it or not, 1906.
Wow. Over a century ago. What happened back then? What was the spark?
It was a novel, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle.
Ah, yeah, I've heard of that.
Its descriptions of the Chicago meatpacking industry were just
Mm.
incredibly graphic. Horrifying, really.
The sources mention things like shoveling meat alongside rats
Yeah.
and workers falling into vats.
Exactly. Just visceral stuff. And it caused this massive public uproar
So people demanded action.
immediately. Congress responded pretty quickly, passing two huge laws in 1906, the Pure Food and Drugs Act and the Meat Inspection Act.
Okay. And their purpose was?
Well, initially, it was pretty straightforward. Stop companies selling adulterated food, spoiled, unsafe, mislabeled stuff, and also ensure animal health through inspection before slaughter.
Makes sense.
But here's a key point the sources make, something that still affects us today. This created a dual system.
How so?
Well, the USDA got meat inspection, mainly because they already had vets in their Bureau of Animal Industry. Made sense administratively, sort of.
Okay.
But the Bureau of Chemistry, which later became the FDA and moved out of USDA, got responsibility for all other foods under the Pure Food and Drugs Act.
Ah, so a split right from the start, based on convenience, not necessarily logic for safety.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that division, that fragmentation, the sources argue it's been a source of problems ever since. Coordination issues, gaps, overlaps.
Right. And how did they actually inspect meat back then? The sources used a phrase, poke and sniff.
Yeah, that's what they called it, poke and sniff.
Doesn't sound very scientific.
Well, it wasn't, not by today's standards. But it was effective for catching things you could see or smell. Certain animal diseases like trichinosis.
But the big limitation?
Exactly. It couldn't detect the invisible threats, like bacteria, microbes.
Which, as we know now, are a huge part of food safety. So the focus shifted over time.
Oh, dramatically.
Yeah.
Through much of the 20th century, the big public scares were often about chemicals, additives, pesticides.
Right. I remember the sources mentioning saccharine concerns in the 80s.
Yeah, that got a lot of press. But all the while, microbial hazards, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, they were kind of flying under the radar, at least in terms of public perception and, to some extent, regulation.
But that wasn't where the main risk actually was. The sources seem to point out a mismatch.
A huge mismatch. By the late 1980s, health officials knew salmonella was in like a third of all poultry.
A third, wow.
Yeah, and they estimated millions of illnesses every year from microbes, way more than documented harm from chemicals. Yet, if you polled the public, chemicals and pesticides were still their top worry.
That perception gap is fascinating. So why did microbes become such a big recognized issue later on? Better science.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
But a huge factor, according to the sources, was the change in food production itself. Centralization,
No.
raising huge numbers of animals in one place, industrial-scale farming. It created, well, perfect conditions for pathogens to spread.
Ah, okay.
Think about managing massive amounts of manure. The sources mention issues like using raw waste as fertilizer, which could directly contaminate crops.
Right, and then you get these really nasty new bugs emerging. And the sources talked a lot about E. coli 0157.H7, What makes that one so bad?
Well, it's a particularly nasty variant and actually pick up a gene from another bacterium, Shigella, that lets it produce a powerful toxin.
A toxin. Okay.
Yeah. And this toxin can cause severe illness, bloody diarrhea,
Yeah.
kidney failure. It's especially dangerous for young kids. Can be fatal.
And the modern food system makes it easier for something like that to spread.
Exactly. Large-scale processing means a single contamination event can affect a huge amount of food, distributed widely. It provides new pathways for these pathogens.
And contamination isn't just happening at one point, right? It's a chain reaction.
Absolutely. The sources stress this. Pathogens can be introduced or spread at the farm during processing by handlers in stores or restaurants, even in your own kitchen.
Which leads to finger pointing, I imagine.
Oh, definitely. The sources call it sharing blame. Producers might blame processors blame producers, government might blame both, and often everyone points to the consumer not cooking it right.
Right. And this highlights how the old system, the poke and sniff, just wasn't equipped for this.
Completely inadequate for microbial threats.
And the sources say that even today, agencies often lack the authority to really prevent problems before food reaches us.
That's a crucial point. Their power under those old 1906 laws is often limited, especially when it comes to preventative controls on farms or in plants,
And attempts to give them more power.
often met with fierce resistance. The sources describe how food producers, their lobbyists, and allies in Congress have frequently blocked efforts to strengthen preventative regulations or enforcement.
Even the agencies themselves sometimes resisted.
Sometimes, yes. Or courts have interpreted the old laws in ways that limit what agencies can mandate. It's a complex web of resistance.
So, okay, the old system isn't working for microbes. How do you shift towards prevention?
That's where HACCP comes in. Hazard analysis and critical control point.
Right. HACCP, I've heard that term.
It's a science-based system.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is to identify the specific points in the food production process where hazards like harmful microbes could realistically occur.
The critical control points.
Exactly. And then you implement specific, monitored controls at those points to prevent the hazard or reduce it to a safe level. It's proactive, not reactive.
The sources mentioned it even worked for astronauts.
Yeah. Food scientists proved it could ensure food safety even in the extreme environment of space.
So, clearly effective. But what pushed it into the mainstream here on Earth, especially for meat?
Tragically, it was a major outbreak. The Jack-in-the-Box E. coli disaster in the early 90s.
Oh, I remember that. It was awful.
It was. Multiple deaths, hundreds sick, mostly children. It was a huge wake-up call. The company's stock plummeted. They had to completely change their cooking procedures.
Yeah.
And it really drove home the need for more robust, preventative government oversight. The public demanded it.
You'd think, given the science in that tragedy, implementing HACCP would be a no-brainer. But the sources say there was pushback.
Oh, significant pushback. The meat industry primarily fought it pretty hard.
Why? What were their arguments?
Often framed in scientific terms, ironically. Things like cooking kills microbes anyway, suggesting preventative steps weren't the government's role or were unnecessary burdens.
Interesting. Anyone else resist?
Yeah, surprisingly, some meat inspectors weren't keen. HACCP shifted their job from visually inspecting every carcass, the poke and sniff legacy, to reviewing paperwork, monitoring plans, checking data. It was a big change.
Mm-hmm.
And even some consumer safety advocates had reservations. They worried HACCP might give too much control and responsibility to the industry itself. You know, the fox guarding the henhouse argument.
So a lot of different angles of resistance. How did the actual rollout go? Was it smooth?
Not exactly smooth, and definitely not uniform. USDA did manage to mandate HACCP for meat and poultry. That included performance standards, targets for reducing pathogens like salmonella, and testing for E. coli.
Okay, so that happened for meat. What about everything else, like seafood, produce, juices? That's FDA territory.
Right, and the FDA had a much tougher time. They regulated so many different kinds of foods, produced in so many different ways. They ended up taking a sort of piecemeal, food-by-food approach.
The sources mentioned seafood in 97, sprouts and eggs 99, juices 2000.
Exactly. Slow progress. And for many, many foods under FDA's watch, HACCP remained voluntary for years. The sources point out that even by 1999, less than half of seafood processors had implemented HACCP plans.
Wow. Why the struggle for FDA?
A big part was resources. The FDA simply didn't have the funding or staffing for such a massive undertaking across thousands of facilities. Plus, the political resistance was still there.
And even when rules were in place, they could be challenged. You mentioned a court case.
Yes, a really significant one in 2001. An appeals court sided with the beef industry. They argued that salmonella wasn't technically an adulterant under the old 1906 Meat Inspection Act because, well, proper cooking kills it.
Seriously, so finding salmonella didn't automatically mean the meat was illegal.
According to that court, yes. It effectively struck down the USDA's salmonella performance standards, a key part of their HACCP rule. The industry, as the sources note, called it a triumph of reason over regulation.
That seems like a huge setback for prevention.
It definitely highlighted how the old legal framework could undermine modern safety approaches.
Let's talk about specific incidents. The Odwalla apple juice outbreak in '96. What did that teach us?
That was crucial. It showed first that dangerous pathogens like E. coli weren't just a meat problem. They could turn up in unexpected places like fresh juice.
Right.
It also highlighted the risks when companies prioritize certain values like fresh or natural over established safety science. Odwalla didn't pasteurize, believing their washing process was enough. They even used windfall apples, dropped fruit, which are known to be riskier.
So it really drove home the need for HACCP across the board.
Absolutely, for all foods based on risk, not just historical categories.
And what about that non-intact beef issue in '99? What was that fight about?
That was USDA trying to adapt to new processing methods, things like mechanically tenderizing beef or injecting it with marinades.
Okay.
Well, those processes can push bacteria from the surface inside the meat, so just cooking the surface isn't enough. USDA wanted to classify such meat as adulterated if it had surface pathogens, requiring a different handling or labeling.
And the industry reaction?
The sources describe it as shock, disbelief, anger. They saw it as government overreach, a political move, not a necessary safety step based on the science of internal contamination.
It keeps coming back to politics, doesn't it? The sources even mentioned the Mike Espy situation.
Yeah, the former agriculture secretary who accepted gifts sports tickets traveled from Tyson Foods lobbyists.
While poultry safety rules were being debated.
Exactly. He was ultimately acquitted of corruption charges, but the sources emphasized the perception problem. It created this lingering sense that access and favors, even seemingly small ones, could potentially influence policy or enforcement, giving industry undue sway.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Another huge area the sources cover is food biotechnology, GMOs.
Right, a major topic.
How did the sources characterize the industry perspective on GMOs?
Generally, very positively, as perhaps the most important scientific tool for feeding a growing world population. They highlight potential benefits like improved nutrition. Golden rice often comes up as the example there, and argue it's faster and more precise than conventional breeding.
So, lots of promise from their viewpoint.
And huge economic potential, of course. Big R&D investment aiming for big market share. Though the sources note initial market projections were perhaps overly optimistic. Still, big business.
Okay. If the industry sees so much potential, why has it been so controversial with the public, especially in some parts of the world?
Trust. That's where the sources come back to again and again.
Trust in who?
Trust in the companies developing the tech and trust in the government agencies regulating it. The sources show a clear link. If public trust is low, concern about safety goes way up, regardless of the scientific consensus.
And the regulatory approach differs globally.
Massively. The U.S. approach, led by the FDA, was essentially that GMOs weren't fundamentally different if they were substantially similar to existing foods. They decided to regulate them mostly under existing food additives rules without requiring special labels.
Okay. And Europe?
Much more cautious. The sources detail the EU's precautionary principle approach. Mandatory labeling, rigorous pre-market risk assessments, post-market monitoring, and outright bans on some things the U.S. allows, like hormone-treated beef. This difference really fueled global debate.
What specific safety concerns about GMOs did the sources highlight?
Allergens were a big one early on. The worry that you could accidentally transfer a gene for an allergen, the example used was a Brazil nut protein put into soybeans.
Right, that could be dangerous for people with allergies.
Exactly. And the sources point out that the FDA initially considered rules for mandatory labeling of biotech allergens, but ultimately backed away. A strong implication is industry pressure stopped it.
And environmental impacts, like superweeds.
Yes. The concern that weeds would evolve resistance to herbicides, like Roundup, that are paired with herbicide-tolerant GMO crops.
Which has happened, right?
It has become a significant issue in agriculture. And then there was the concern about non-target organisms. The sources specifically detail the controversy around buttcorn pollen, potentially harming monarch butterflies.
How did the industry respond to that monarch study?
According to the sources, pretty aggressively. They funded counter-studies, worked to publicly discredit the initial research, and even exerted influence over a scientific symposium to control the messaging and ensure favorable conclusions were presented.
Wow. Okay, so all these concerns, the trust issues, the different regulatory takes, it all funneled into a huge fight over labeling.
Absolutely fierce. The food and biotech industries fought mandatory GMO labeling with everything they had.
Why? What was their main argument against it?
They framed it as a warning label. They argued it implied GMOs were unsafe or different, even when regulators said they weren't, and that it would scare consumers and destroy market acceptance.
But the counter argument.
Was that consumers have a right to know what's in their food, and that transparency actually builds trust. The sources suggest that if the industry had been more open and if consumers saw clear benefits, labeling might not have been the death sentence they feared.
And in the absence of mandatory U.S. labels, the market kind of responded anyway.
It did. You saw the rise of voluntary, non-GMO project verified labels, driven purely by consumer demand. Major food companies, Gerber, Heinz, Frito-Lay, even McDonald's in some areas, started sourcing non-GM ingredients for certain products to meet that demand.
So consumer pressure made a difference.
Definitely. The sources quote someone saying GM crops became an albatross around the neck of farmers in some sectors because finding buyers who wanted them became harder.
The sources also touched on patenting life and Terminator technology.
Yes, briefly. Concerns about the sheer breadth of patents on genes and processes, controlled by just a few large companies. And Terminator seeds, engineered to be sterile after one harvest raised alarms about farmer dependency and control over the food supply. That technology wasn't widely commercialized due to backlash, but the debate highlighted ethical concerns.
But public pressure could be effective, right? Like with the organic standards.
Oh, that was a landmark case study in the sources. USDA proposed rules that would have allowed foods that were genetically modified or irradiated or even grown using sewage sludge to be certified organic.
That seems counterintuitive to what most people think organic means.
Exactly, and the public reaction was overwhelming. The USDA received over 275,000 comments, almost all vehemently negative. It was a massive grassroots mobilization.
And USDA backed down?
Completely. They rewrote the rules to explicitly prohibit those practices in organic production. The sources hold it up as proof that organized consumer and advocate pressure can force significant change, even against powerful interests.
Okay, so beyond GMOs and HACCP, what other things came up in the sources? Irradiation.
Yeah, irradiation, using radiation to kill microbes on food.
A technical fix, basically.
Right. Supported by the food industry and some politicians, the sources mention a farm bill that tried to equate irradiation with pasteurization legally. But public acceptance has always been the hurdle.
The I want to be the second person to try it mentality.
Pretty much. Deep-seated consumer skepticism about irradiating food. And the sources also suggest industry liked the idea of the kill step, but maybe didn't want the increased accountability that might come with using it if something still went wrong.
What about pasteurization itself? Like the raw milk debate.
That's a classic example of the tension between sort of perceived benefits, taste, tradition, maybe health claims, and known risks. Raw milk can carry dangerous pathogens.
Lethal ones, even.
Potentially, yes, especially for vulnerable groups. The sources frame it as a complex issue involving consumer choice, but note the risks aren't always borne by the person making the choice. And we saw with Odwalla, sometimes a company only adopts pasteurization after an outbreak forces the issue.
Does litigation play a role? Lawsuits after outbreaks.
It should, in theory. Multi-million-dollar lawsuits like the one following the Jack in the Box outbreak are meant to be a powerful incentive for companies to prioritize safety. But the sources argue it's not always that simple. Because responsibility can be diffused across the long chain from farm to fork, it can be hard to pinpoint blame solely on the producer, especially if handling by a retailer or restaurant is also implicated. This can weaken the deterrent effect for the original source of the contamination.
Okay, one more threat the sources discussed, particularly after 9/11, bioterrorism.
Right, a chilling possibility. The sources quote the then Health Secretary Tommy Thompson expressing surprise that terrorists hadn't targeted the food supply, saying it seemed so easy to do.
That's alarming. Did it lead to big changes?
It led to increased focus on food security, but mostly in the anti-terrorism sense, protecting the supply chain from intentional contamination.
What kind of measures?
Congress did allocate some funding, mostly for things like slightly increasing inspections of imported foods, though it only went from like 1% to 2% initially, and new rules requiring food facilities to register with the FDA. But The sources suggest it wasn't really a comprehensive preventative overhaul, more like patching specific vulnerabilities.
And the sources connect this anti-terrorism idea of food security with the other meaning, the humanitarian one.
Yes,
Yeah.
they draw that parallel. Humanitarian food security is about everyone having reliable access to enough safe, nutritious, culturally acceptable food. Conflict, like in Afghanistan as mentioned in the sources, devastates that kind of security, leading to starvation and illness. Food bioterrorism is scary because it attacks both aspects, potentially causing mass illness and disrupting access and trust in the food supply itself.
So if we pull all this together, what's the final assessment of the U.S. regulatory system from these sources? It sounds problematic.
Deeply problematic is the conclusion from the material. The fragmentation is a constant theme.
The USDA-FDA split.
Yeah, and the weird specific examples like who regulates chicken broth versus beef broth. It's based on history and agency turf, not risk or logic.
Right.
Then there's the limited authority. Agencies often can't force recalls without specific laws. They rely on voluntary cooperation, which doesn't always happen quickly. They lack resources. The FDA's own science board pointed this out. And political influence and industry resistance are pervasive roadblocks.
So what's the proposed solution that keeps coming up in the sources?
The most common recommendation from experts and consumer groups cited is creating a single food safety agency.
Consolidating everything under one roof.
Exactly. The argument is it would improve efficiency, reduce those weird overlaps and gaps, potentially lessen political influence, for example, by moving FDA food funding oversight from agriculture committees in Congress to health committees and allow for a more coherent approach to food security in all senses.
But that kind of major government reorganization is hard to achieve, right?
Extremely hard, politically difficult. So in reality, what we often see are smaller, incremental steps. The FDA issues new voluntary guidelines. They try to collaborate more with USDA. But even those smaller steps can face resistance, like small farmers worrying that new voluntary standards will put them at a disadvantage compared to big operations. Ultimately, the core argument running through all this source material is pretty stark. Food safety isn't just a technical problem of science and handling. It's fundamentally a political problem.
Political how?
Tied up in commerce, international trade negotiations, economic interests. The sources argue quite forcefully that corporate commercial interests too often outweigh consumer protection, and that government agencies, subject to all these pressures, frequently end up siding with business priorities over public health mandates.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a journey we've taken through this material.
Yep.
From, the shocking conditions that led to the first laws over a century ago, through recognizing invisible microbial threats, the huge fights over implementing preventative systems like HACCP, navigating the really complex world of GMOs, the science, the public trust, the labeling battles,
Yeah.
and looking at other challenges like irradiation, bioterrorism risks, and this persistent underlying problem of a fragmented, politically influenced regulatory system. It really paints a picture of a system struggling to keep up, built on an old foundation.
It really does. I think the key things to take away are definitely that historical legacy, how decisions made in 1906 still shape things today, that constant tension between industry goals and public health, the real difficulty in applying straightforward science in a world driven by values, economics, and politics, and maybe above all, how absolutely critical and how fragile public trust is in this whole equation.
This has been incredibly insightful, really digging into the sources you provided. Thank you so much for sharing them with us.
My pleasure. It's fascinating, if sometimes troubling material. And maybe, if we accept the source's main argument that making food truly safe requires political action, that it's tangled up with commerce and trust and global factors, it leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener.
Okay.
Beyond washing your hands and cooking food properly at home, what responsibility do you think falls on you as a consumer, as a citizen, to engage with these bigger system-level issues? How much should our collective decision to prioritize health, maybe even over some commercial interest, factor into actually fixing these complex interconnected problems to ensure everyone has access to safe food? Something to think about. Consider the stakeholders, the power dynamics we've talked about, and where you think real change needs to happen.
Definitely food for thought until
Yeah.
the next deep dive.